Hello and welcome. My name is Susan and I share a new drawing on this channel every single day. I've been practicing portrait sketching for the last 3 years. In today's video, I'll be doing a brush pen portrait sketch demonstration. Virtually all of my daily practice are roughly 20 minutes. In the beginning of my art journey, I've always had trouble keeping the duration within 20 minutes. You see, it's really hard to call it done. I always find that there could be room for improvement. There are more things to be done to the drawing. But lately, using brush pen, I'm finding that I've gotten a lot better at knowing when to stop. At some point, I just think, even though it can be improved further, but it's not going to make a big difference to the untrained eye. I can keep that drive for improvement for my drawing tomorrow. And that's when I'll stop. And I think the reason for using brush pen, it's easier than when I was sketching using a pencil, is just because brush pen is permanent. And the moment I put it down on this piece of paper, I feel like, that is it. This is it. It's really hard to go back and change things. And I think the other thing that brush pen is a lot better for calling things done is just how fast it is to get to the result that I want, right? A broad stroke with using a brush pen is far more prominent compared to pencil sketching. For these reference photos, I always find them on Pinterest. And you may be wondering why I chose this particular one for today's drawing. The truth is, a lot of times I don't think too much about what I want to draw. When I'm having a little bit of downtime between meetings, between tasks, I kind of just fire up Pinterest, and a lot of times the algorithm is doing a very good job at giving me reference photos that I can use for my daily practices. Now, if I really wanted to comment on this reference photo specifically, I think what has drawn me to capture her is just because there's certain ambiguity to her face. I find that's quite interesting, and I don't know if this makes sense to you, but when I look at her, I feel like she could be a 10-year-old or she could be a 20-year-old. It's really hard to know exactly how old she is, and I find that interesting to capture. I think throughout my life, I've always been mistaken as someone who's much, much younger than my age. I remember when I was pregnant and shopping at LCBO, which is a liquor store in Toronto, I got carded even though I was pregnant. And in that moment, I just thought that I don't know what is worse, being carded or being thought that like I could be underage and pregnant and shopping for alcohol all at the same time. But it's things like that that make me wonder, what makes my face so youthful looking, right? That people would keep on mistaking me for someone much younger. And I think it's the same thing when I look at this reference photo. When I look at her, I think she must be underage. But in reality, if I really examine her jewelry choice and her choice for clothing, she could be much older. She could be 20, 30. I just don't know. So what is it that creates this youthful looking face? And I think part of that could be the collagen in her face, right? In her facial structure. There are no wrinkles, very smooth skin, and it doesn't appear like she had a ton of makeup on her either. So I think all that contributes to the fact that her face looks quite youthful to my untrained eye. But I'm sure to other people with different experiences, that could be very different. I think the ambiguity of her age is creating this interest in my head that drives me to want to capture her. But most of the time when I'm pinning something to my Pinterest board that I think makes something a great reference photo, usually it's just the lighting and the interesting facial gaze, I would say. So when it comes to lighting, I always try to find models or reference photos of models that have one singular light source. So in this case, you can see that the light is hitting her face from the top left corner. And it's one single light source because everything else is kind of, in areas that's not so illuminated, it's darkening, right? Which is behind her face, around her hair, even her chest area, it's not as well lit. So that all contributes to a rather easier to capture facial expression. It's easier to identify where the highlights are and where the shadows are going to be. The brush pens that I'm using are kind of these cold gray tones, right? They're from Faber-castell Pitt Artist Pen Brush series, and I like using these a lot because they don't really stain to the back of the page, and it allows me to keep a very neat looking sketchbook. If it bleeds into the next page, it's not a terrible thing, which happens a lot as well in sketchbook drawings. But I mean, the fact that it doesn't, it's just a whole lot better, I think. I always start using the lightest cold gray shade, which is 232. And the reason that I start with this one is just because I'm using it both as a base and also as like the initial sketch. So I would typically go over it with the darkest shade again, so that I'm using like the lightest shade as a test drive, and then using the darkest shade to go over them, because now I have confidence in that is the position of the eye, that is the position of the shadow on her face, etc., etc. I also just try to keep the sketch and the choice of colors to a bare minimum. So I always just keep like, I think 3. At most, I might bring back like the white shade for blending purposes, and I might add in some black in the end if there's truly a contrast that I want to emphasize. But most of the time, I might just go over the darkest shade. I might just use the darkest shade I have, which is just a very dark, cold gray color, to go over the darkest areas that I want to emphasize, instead of using a true black pen to go back in, which I also don't have. I don't really have a Faber-castell black shade. I do have a bunch of other black pens that I can use, but for these daily drawings, most of the time, I just use the 3 shade that I have. And I find that to be enough to capturing the range of values in most of these reference photos. Another property that I quite like about these Faber-castell brush pens is that you can either use it to create these distinct hatching groups, right, which is these lines grouped together, or you can actually flatten it and create a solid shape, right, and then there's no streaks within them. So it really depends on how you use these. And the reason I like it is just because sometimes I do want to create distinct grouping of lines. I want you to see that there are lines, that these lines depict a certain particular item that I want to create emphasis for. But then sometimes I don't really want the lines to be all that obvious. I don't want these stylized lines to be shown. I want your eye to kind of blur it out, like you naturally don't notice them if it's just a blob of color, right? And that's what I want to create a lot of times in shadows or in areas that I just don't really need you to look at it so closely, because the lines, they create details, right? If you can clearly identify that that's a grouping of lines, that is one stroke, that you can see that that's a stroke, then usually that means that's something that I want to create emphasis for. Usually that means that's where I'm adding a lot of details. And the focal point most of the time for all portraits are around the midsection of the face, right? It's the golden triangle between the eyes and the nose, especially when this portrait, she's just gazing right back at you. So that's definitely where your eyes are going to be drawn towards. So the areas that are receding back to the background are going to be the hair, the neckline, like none of that is really important. So I really want that to just fade to the background. And the way to create that effect is just to not adding really strong lines, right? So imagine a drawing where or even just like an image, right, that you do some post-processing and you're highlighting a lot of the textures in that image, that texture is what makes things stand out, right? And the things that it's going to make stand out are the lines. So if you really want something to not be so obvious in your face, you want to blur it out. And the way to blur it out is to create more smooth patchings, right, with the choice of material or the tool that you're using. And in this case, one of the properties I really like about this brush pen is the fact that you're able to create both, right? Which is very similar to using pencil, right? When I'm sketching with pencils, one of the things I like to do is to blend out areas with a blender or with like a even just tissue paper and my pencil or and my finger. I could blend out the pencil so that it's creating a blurring and soft edge, right? Or a smooth transition when it comes to the shadow areas or, transitions between light to dark. And when it comes to pen sketching, one of the things I struggle with is if you're using any pen, most of the time it's going to create these very distinct strokes. But I'm finding that when I use these Faber-castell brush pens, I'm able to create these more smoothing line strokes together to create kind of like a singular patch. And I could darkening certain areas, like going back in with the same shade, I can create a deepening and darkening depth effect. And a lot of you have commented on my shorts mentioning that, hey, that looks like a vintage photo. And I think it does, right? It looks like a vintage photo because I'm able to create this smoothing, this really blurred out look by deepening and darkening some regions. But this is just kind of like my artistic choice, I would say. When it comes to sketching, you certainly don't need to do one or the other. There are a lot of contour sketching artists that make very distinct lines, right? It's very obvious to me that those artists want to create or establish a sense of groupings of lines that's organized and intentional, and it's meaningful as well to them. But I think that's just not my style. I think I do want certain areas of my sketching, of my drawing to rescind back, and I think the easiest way to do that is to not make the lines so obvious. And I think there are areas where I do want the lines to be obvious, and usually for me, that's areas I want to create details for, areas where I want to create emphasis for, and I want your eyes to drawn to these areas. So I think a natural way for me to create that contrast is to make the areas I don't want you to focus on more blurred out, and the areas I want you to focus on to create these very contoured lines. And for me, that's usually wrapping around the face, around the cheek, around the focal point, towards the lightest region on the model's face. And you don't have to follow this rule, and it's not really a rule either. It's just something that I have developed, that I have started to practice around. And I think everyone is free to experiment and come up with your own unique style. Some people like lines, some people don't like lines. I'm sure you've seen these charcoal drawings where it's so smooth that there are zero lines, right? The only line that you can probably identify on these charcoal drawings are just the line that depicts, or the plane that depicts the light versus dark. And usually you have these planes is because there's these super high contrast areas. And that's another style, right? That's polar opposite. I think that's also not me. I don't ever want to create just like these super smooth out looks either. I think that's also, it looks very superficial to me. I think in life, when you're looking at anything at all, lines is part of what we experience as well. You can't completely get rid of lines. Lines are beautiful. But then there are also things that, the lines are not as obvious. It just becomes an area. It becomes a blob. And I think when you experience that, when it's just a blob, when it's just blurry, it creates this sense of emptiness, it creates a sense of vastness. Like if you look at landscape, right, there are very few lines in landscape. It's probably the only lines you experience when you're looking at landscape is just the line that separates ocean to land, that separates land to sky, right? Those are the strongest lines that you observe. And that creates a sense of vastness because there's just massive scale. It's very hard for you to identify any specific lines because everything is kind of blurred out. Everything is far away. Everything is grand, right? And then there's no lines, or the strongest lines are very minimalistic. And there are other times when, when you just woke up and then you're looking on the ceiling, or you're looking in the sky, you're looking out the window, right? Everything feels very blurred out, and that sense of emptiness or that sense of blurriness is also something that is very interesting to me, I think. But when it comes to portrait studies, I find that it's important to capture lines because there are lines. The lines are what is familiar to you. The reason you look at a face and you can identify it's a face is because you can identify the eyes, you can identify the facial expression, you can identify these things. The lines in the hair, the strokes, right? They mean something to you. And that's why I think lines are beautiful. It's important to have these blobs, these areas, right? But it's also incredibly important, especially in portrait study, to capture lines. And that's what I like about portrait sketching in a way. It's because it's all about lines, because what you're sketching with is this tool that creates lines. It's not a paintbrush, right? If you're looking at paintbrush or painting, and which I do a lot as well, but when it comes to painting, it is about color, right? It's about blobs of colors, it's about shapes. It is a lot less about identifying lines. But when it comes to my daily portrait sketches, I do think it's really practicing my ability to observe lines. What lines are worth it to capture? What lines are not worth it to capture, right? Where are the boundaries? What lines are so important such that it will break or make a drawing, right? And those are the things that I really try to study hard for. And I think with sketching using a pen, it just makes it a lot more important to make sure that the lines that I do capture are important, because it's a lot harder to blur out the lines afterwards. Once you're using a pen and you put it down, that line stays there. It's really hard to erase a line afterwards, right? I mean, it's not impossible. You can still blur out lines even if it's using a pen. You can make that line into a blob. You can blur out the visibility of that line, the crispness of that line. But it's just a little bit harder. And now you can see that I'm just using this darkest shade to going back in and darkening areas. And this is what I mean by creating depth, right? By going back in with this darkest gray and darkening certain areas, I'm creating depth to this portrait sketch. Most of the time, I'm quite lazy when it comes to capturing accessories or even clothing. I find that they're just not as important to capture, I think. For example, in this drawing, I omit the fact that she has earrings. I didn't even bother with drawing her and her shoulder, her clothes, right? It's really just capturing her facial expression, that gaze, and the pouty look that she has on her face, which I think is very interesting to capture. So that's kind of what I focused on. And about her likeness, I think I, to a certain degree, capture her likeness in this drawing as well, but it's not like you can just look at it and really identify who she is. To be honest, I don't know who she is either. If you know who she is and she indeed is a famous person, please do let me know. Most of the time when it comes to choosing who I draw, I rarely pick a famous person. And you know why? It's just because if I were to go and search up a famous person to draw, it feels too intentional. It feels like, oh, I had to attach certain value to this individual, and why am I drawing this individual versus another famous person? You know what I mean? It just feels like too much mental load for me, and I do get a lot of requests on my videos saying, oh, why don't you draw this person next, that person next? But first of all, I have to go and look them up. I have to then look up a specific photo I want to draw of that individual. Like, that's a lot of overhead, you know what I mean? So for the time being, they're just gonna be whoever.